Our next guest is Eduardo Sousa. I mentioned him briefly when I introduced Peter. He's been the regional organizer for the Council of Canadians for Ontario, Quebec, and Nunavut for the past 6 years. He has a master's degree in environmental studies from York University in watershed education and planning, also community development, and is particularly interested in restoring urban streams. He's been a social justice activist for 15 years, and we're delighted that you're here with us tonight, Eduardo.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm going to do my best to stand. Unfortunately, I've got some neck problems today, so I may have to sit down at some point, but I'll try and project my voice. It is a real pleasure to be here to talk to you about specific aspects of the SPP. Peter did a fantastic job of sort of laying out the broad strokes and giving you some very concrete examples of how the SPP is already impacting in Canada. And you know, when you really think about it, given what you've just heard, I mean, it is so complex, it's so broad-ranging that, you know, when you sit down and really start to think about this and start to put the pieces together, it's its own form of shock and awe. I mean, it really is overwhelming. And all we can really do, I think, other than to sort of keep the broad strokes and a larger picture in mind, is to also think about specific aspects of it and fight overall the agenda, but also on specific pieces of it. Now, I wanted to thank Peggy Nash and her office for organizing this event. You wouldn't otherwise be hearing about this if it wasn't for Peggy Nash and her staff, so thank you very much for organizing this. And thank you, Sherry, for stepping in as well this evening. And condolences personally to Peggy Nash, and also on behalf of the Council of Canadians for the loss of her father. It's very sad news indeed. So what I wanted to do was talk to you a little bit, I guess, about, as I said, specific aspects of the Security and Prosperity Partnership. And also, I guess, I mean, this has been in play for quite a number of years now. In fact, it can be traced back, I mean, you know, Peter sort of contextualized this in terms of NAFTA and whatnot and how the SPP builds on NAFTA. But the SPP really started to take off right after September 9/11, or the sort of the tragedy of 9/11. And so it's been an agenda that's really been accelerating since September 2001, especially, as I say, after those series of tragic events where shortly thereafter Thomas DeKino, the head of the chief executives, basically said that you know, in order to keep the borders open, we now need to think about security and trade as being profoundly interlinked. So this agenda has been in play for quite a number of years now. And I really need to thank also, in this regard, in terms of bringing this sort of out into Parliament and through different venues, Peter, for the work you've been doing through these town halls and work on Parliament Hill, because otherwise people wouldn't be hearing about this. The Liberals, as Peter mentioned, started this whole process, and it's been seamlessly carried through under the Conservatives. And if it wasn't for the NDP, and also credit must be given to the Greens and to the Bloc to some degree, because they've been opposing this as well, but it's really been Peter and other members of the NDP caucus that have been really pushing on this and trying to, you know, bring this out into the light of day. So thank you very much for bringing this out. So what I wanted to do was basically talk specifically about water and our natural resources like oil. I wanted to talk a little bit about also how the SPP is being implemented across the country in other forms other than through the SPP itself. I wanted to talk also a little bit about what our demands are and what you folks could do about this. So in terms of its threat to the control of our natural resources like oil, gas, and water. As I mentioned, since the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. business elites in this country have been really concerned around border issues and the fact that trade was slowing down. Thomas DeKino basically said that we need to engage in more fundamental harmonization and integration with the United States if we're going to keep the border open to trade. So this led to a series of secretive and public meetings and initiatives amongst the big business elites in the country and with the U.S. that eventually led to the creation of the SPP. And this was back in March of 2005, where you may have heard of the Three Amigos Summit. This was Paul Martin, Prime Minister at the time, along with President Bush and then President Vicente Fox. They met in Waco, Texas, and launched the SPP as the Three Amigos Summit. Now, however, what's interesting about this as well, given that, as I mentioned, this agenda goes back to 2001, is that 2 years prior to the SPP being announced publicly as public policy across the three countries, that the chief executives had come up with their own document called the North American Security and Prosperity Initiative. Right? So 2 years before the announcement of the SPP, the chief executives had already their own document in place, which they pushed. Essentially, a private sector initiative became public policy without any consultation with Canadians. And all this history is very well documented and available on a number of websites. We've got a very good chronology as well that really helps lay things out from 2001 until the present time to today, really. And in fact, we are just within days of the next SPP summit in New Orleans. This is the 4th SPP summit. And it'll begin, I believe, it's April 20th, I think? Sunday,
Monday and Tuesday.
Monday and Tuesday of next week, the next SPP summit. Now, what's interesting, a bit of a side note on this, is you're not going to see, they're not going to call this the SPP summit, right? There's already a movement underway by vested interests to rebrand the SPP as something else. You need to be very clear on this. And this is very deliberate, and it's deliberate because it's become controversial and more Canadians are knowing about this. So, and that's a strategy. You know, if you have a set target, you make it sort of shift by rebranding it, right? So when Bush announced during the State of the Union address that the three leaders would be meeting in New Orleans, he called it the North American Leaders Summit, or the Summit of the North American Leaders. He didn't refer to it as the SPP. Harper and any of the press releases that are coming out here when they meet next week are not referring to this as an SPP summit. It's clearly very much that's what it is. So it's just something to keep in mind. And even the announcements that have been coming out in the last little while as well, speaking of rebranding, the fast tracking of the drug approvals process that Peter referred to, there's no mention in the media as that being an SPP initiative. Now, a year ago, again, another example, when Peter was mentioning also around the lowering of standards around pesticide residues on our fruits and vegetables, that was announced as an SPP initiative. That was over a year ago, right? But other initiatives that have come along since, whether in terms of food quality standards or in terms of military integration, none of that is being contextualized or connected to the SPP. So that, as another example, the Civil Assistance Plan. How many of you have heard of the Civil Assistance Plan? Yeah, one or two. Well, CAP was announced a few weeks ago. Well, in fact, it wasn't even announced in Canada. It was announced in the United States. And it's an agreement between the Canadian and U.S. militaries that allows the U.S. military on Canadian soil and the Canadian military on U.S. soil in the event of natural disasters, in the event of terrorist attacks. Okay? This is under the SPP. This is about military integration. But nowhere in those communiques south of the border was there any mention of as this being an SPP initiative. What's even worse is that there was no announcement on this side of the border at all. We found out about this through an American newspaper. The Harper government didn't make any announcement on this at all. And when the Canadian military was pressed on this, they said that there would be an announcement made on this, but it would come out through one of their military newspapers. So most people don't know about this. The National Post of all newspapers did sort of break the news back in February 22nd. Canada and U.S. agreed to share troops in civil emergencies. This was a National Post. So that's been one of the few media pieces on this, right? Again, part of the SPP, and they've completely decontextualized it and disconnected it from it. Because again, you know, if you start to do that, if you don't see the overall picture, it's hard to sort of have a target in place to fight against. So a very deliberate strategy here.